Adia was the light of her family's home, the kind of girl whose laughter could momentarily chase away the shadows of hardship. She was young, too young, some would say, on the cusp of womanhood, with a spirit unbroken despite the weight of poverty pressing against her shoulders. Her beauty was undeniable, the kind that made people stop and stare, but it was her kindness that truly set her apart. Even when hunger gnawed at her belly, she shared what little she had with those who had even less. She lived with her parents and younger siblings in a small mud hut at the edge of the village, where the land was dry and the days stretched long with toil. Her father, Kwame, was once a proud hunter, but time had stolen his strength. Now, he spent his days searching for work, his once powerful hands reduced to trembling fingers. Her mother, Abina, had grown thin from giving the last of their food to the children, her once bright eyes dulled by exhaustion. It was no secret that the family was struggling. The villagers pitied them, but pity did not put food on the table. And so, when Baba Kofi sent word that he wished to take Adia as his wife, her father saw it as the answer to their prayers. Baba Kofi was a man of great wealth, his compound the largest in the village, his cattle fat even when others starved. But he was old, far older than any man Adia had ever met. His presence commanded both respect and fear, and whispers followed him like the wind. Some said he never aged, that his hair had been silver for as long as anyone could remember. Others swore his past wives had simply vanished, their names erased as if they had never existed. The villagers spoke in hushed tones. She is too young. He is powerful. No one refuses him. She will disappear like the others. But Kwame did not listen. This is a blessing, he told Adia, gripping her shoulders tightly. He will provide for you. And for us. Adia looked at her mother, searching for a sign that she would protest, that she would fight for her daughter's freedom. But Abina only turned away, shoulders shaking, unable to meet her daughter's eyes. That night, under the great baobab tree, Adia sat in silence, staring at the moon. The weight of her fate pressed heavy on her chest. Then, from the darkness, she felt it, the presence of another. Slowly, she turned her head. At the edge of the trees stood Baba Kofi. His eyes, dark and knowing, held hers across the distance. He did not move, but the air between them thickened, charged with something she could not name. Adia's hands trembled in her lap. Her fate had been sealed. The day of the wedding arrived with an unsettling stillness, as if the very air held its breath. There was no music, no laughter, no sound of children playing in the dust. The villagers gathered, but they did not rejoice. They only watched, their faces blank, their eyes shifting away whenever Adia turned her gaze upon them. She stood at the center of it all, draped in a red veil that covered her face entirely. The fabric felt heavy, suffocating, as though it carried the weight of every girl who had come before her. Beneath it, her lips trembled, her throat dry with unspoken fear. Baba Kofi waited for her at the front of the gathering, his posture regal despite the years carved into his skin. His robes were pristine, his silver hair tied back, but his hands trembled. Whether from age or something else, Adia could not tell. Her father, Kwame, stood beside her, his expression unreadable. He had done what he believed was right, securing his family's survival at the cost of his daughter's future. But even he could not ignore the strange hush that had settled over the village. The elder presiding over the ceremony cleared his throat. Let the joining be made. Baba Kofi reached out, lifting Adia's wrist with surprising gentleness. From his sleeve, he drew out a golden bracelet, the metal gleaming even in the dim afternoon light. As he slid it over her wrist, Adia shivered. It was cold, colder than iron, colder than the winds that swept through the village at night. A chill crawled up her arm, spreading through her veins like ice. The villagers shifted where they stood, some casting uneasy glances at the band. A single voice, cracked with age, broke the silence. Do not sleep beneath his roof. Adia's breath hitched. She turned her head, searching the crowd, and found an old woman standing near the back, her wrinkled hands gripping a wooden staff. Her eyes, dark, knowing, bore into Adia's through the veil. For a moment, the world seemed to hold still. Then, Kwame stepped forward, his grip tightening on Adia's shoulder. He did not acknowledge the warning. Baba Kofi, too, remained unfazed. He merely lowered her wrist, letting the bracelet settle against her skin. "You are mine now," he murmured, so softly only she could hear. The ceremony ended without celebration. There was no feast, no dancing, no songs sung in honor of the bride. The villagers dispersed quickly, their faces turned away as they hurried back to their homes. Even Adia's mother, Abina, only pressed a brief, shaking kiss to her daughter's forehead before stepping back into the shadows. As the sun began to set, Baba Kofi led Adia toward his home, a grand, sprawling compound at the far end of the village, where the trees grew thicker and the wind whispered secrets. Adia did not look back. But the warning echoed in her mind. Do not sleep beneath his roof. The journey to Baba Kofi's mansion was steeped in silence. Adia walked beside her new husband, the golden bracelet still cold against her wrist, its weight growing heavier with every step. The village lights faded behind them, swallowed by the thickening trees. When they finally reached the mansion, Adia hesitated. It was larger than she had imagined, a relic of stone and time, standing alone at the edge of the world. Vines crawled along the outer walls, as if the forest itself sought to reclaim it. The air smelled damp, like old wood and something forgotten. Baba Kofi pushed open the great wooden doors, and the house swallowed them whole. Inside, the silence was deeper, stretching into every corner. No servants bustled about. No fires crackled in the hearths. The air was stale, and the grand halls, though adorned with ancient tapestries and gleaming ornaments, felt abandoned. Adia turned to Baba Kofi, but he was already moving ahead. "You will sleep in the east chamber," he said without looking at her. "You must never enter my room." And, his voice trailed off for a moment before he turned to face her fully. "You will not wander the house at night." His dark eyes searched hers, waiting for something, perhaps obedience, perhaps fear. Adia lowered her gaze. "Yes, my husband." A shadow of something flickered across his face before he nodded. He led her through the halls, his footsteps the only sound in the cavernous space. When they reached a large wooden door, he pushed it open. The room inside was modest compared to the grandeur of the rest of the house. A simple bed, a small window, a basin of water. "This is yours." His voice was distant. "Rest now." Then, without another word, he shut the door behind him. Adia stood motionless for a long time, listening to his fading steps. Only when the last echo died did she exhale. She turned slowly, studying the chamber. It was comfortable but cold, untouched, as if no one had slept here for years. She tried to rest, but the silence pressed against her ears. There were no village sounds, no night birds calling, no distant voices. It was an emptiness so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat. Sleep would not come. Adia sat up, glancing at the door. Baba Kofi had warned her not to wander, but something about the house gnawed at her. The walls felt too thick, the air too still. Her fingers brushed the golden bracelet on her wrist as she swung her legs off the bed. Her bare feet touched the cold floor, and she moved carefully into the hall. The mansion stretched endlessly in both directions. Flickering lanterns lined the walls, casting long shadows that moved as she did. She walked past empty rooms, grand but lifeless, each whispering of something long gone. Then she saw it. At the far end of the corridor stood a door unlike the others. It was carved from dark wood, its surface covered in strange symbols, marks that twisted and curled like vines, but with meaning just beyond her grasp. The hairs on her arms rose. She stepped closer. Something was behind it. She pressed her palm against the wood. It was warm, pulsing beneath her fingers. Her breath caught. Then, a sound. A whisper. Adia froze. She leaned in, pressing her ear against the carvings. And then she heard them. Women. Crying. Their voices rose and fell, muffled but unmistakable. Some whimpered, others sobbed. And beneath it all, a single voice whispered her name. Adia stumbled back, her heart hammering. The house was supposed to be empty. Her breath came in sharp gasps. The golden bracelet on her wrist burned against her skin, but she couldn't tear her eyes from the door. The crying continued. And the whispering voice, chilling and familiar, spoke again. Adia, run. Adia's hands trembled as she clutched the key, its cold metal pressing into her palm. She had stolen it while Baba Kofi slept, her fingers light as a whisper against his robes. The moment he had drifted into deep slumber, his breath slow and steady, she had slipped away into the darkness of the mansion. Now she stood before the forbidden door, her heart hammering against her ribs. The carved symbols on the wood seemed to shift in the dim lantern light, twisting like living things. The whispers beyond the door had faded, but an eerie silence had settled in their place, thick and expectant. Adia swallowed hard and slid the key into the lock. The metal turned with a quiet click. The door creaked open. A rush of cold air spilled into the hallway, carrying the scent of something ancient, earth, dust, and something else, something sickly sweet. The room was cloaked in shadows, but as Adia stepped inside, the lantern in her hand cast a weak glow over the space. Her breath caught in her throat. They were there. Women. Dozens of them, standing perfectly still along the walls, draped in wedding garments that had not aged. Their faces were serene, their hands gently folded before them as if caught in a moment of prayer. But they were not breathing. Adia stepped closer, her entire body stiff with fear. She raised the lantern higher, letting the golden light wash over their faces. Not a single wrinkle. Not a single blemish. Their skin was untouched by time. Her gaze fell upon a bride in a red veil, the same shade Adia had worn at her own wedding. The fabric shimmered as if new, though dust lined the hem. Adia's stomach twisted as she reached out with trembling fingers, hesitating before touching the woman's cheek. Cold. Like polished stone. A horrified realization settled in her bones. These women were not just lifeless. They were preserved. Frozen in time. A strangled cry rose in her throat, but before she could move, a shadow stretched across the doorway. A deep, slow voice broke the silence. You should not have done that, my wife. Adia spun around, the lantern slipping from her grip and crashing to the floor. The light sputtered, casting erratic shadows across the walls. Baba Kofi stood at the threshold, but something was different. His once wrinkled hands were now smooth. His face, once carved with age, was young, too young, impossibly so. His dark eyes gleamed, no longer dulled by time, but filled with something unnatural, something hungry. Adia stumbled backward, her pulse thundering. What are you?" she gasped. Baba Kofi smiled, stepping into the room. "You already know, don't you?" His voice had changed too, richer, deeper, carrying an eerie melody. "These women, my wives, they gave me their youth. Their beauty. Their time." Adia's eyes darted back to the frozen brides. A sick realization churned in her stomach. "You stole their years?" Baba Kofi's smile widened, revealing teeth too white, too sharp. "Not stole. They gave them to me. Willingly." His gaze softened with something almost like admiration. "And now, my dear Adia, it is your turn." A surge of cold fear shot through her veins. He moved closer. She had to run. But the door was behind him. And Baba Kofi never looked away. Adia's breath came in ragged gasps as she turned and ran, her bare feet slapping against the cold stone floor. The lantern's shattered remains flickered dimly behind her, its dying glow swallowed by the darkness of the mansion. Baba Kofi's voice followed her, smooth and unwavering. "There is nowhere to run, my love." She refused to listen. Adia sprinted down the hall, her heart hammering in her chest. But something was wrong. The corridors twisted in ways they hadn't before. The walls stretched, shifting, swallowing doors and opening new ones. The house was alive. A cruel laugh echoed behind her. "You belong to me now." She turned sharply, diving through an open doorway, only to find herself back in the grand hall where the wedding feast had been held. The long dining table stood eerily untouched, the golden goblets still full, the plates arranged as if the guests had only just stepped away. But no one had ever eaten here. No one had ever sat at this table. The realization struck like ice in her veins. Adia spun on her heels, searching for another way out. She ran through another door, another twisting hallway, only to emerge again into the grand hall. No escape. A sob of frustration caught in her throat. Think, Adia. Think. Then she saw it. The golden bracelet on her wrist. The weight of it. The unnatural coldness. She remembered the old woman's warning. Do not sleep beneath his roof. But it wasn't just the roof. It was him. The bond. Adia's shaking fingers clawed at the bracelet, but it would not budge. The metal was too tight, as if it had fused to her skin. Baba Kofi stepped into the hall, his youthful face glowing with cruel amusement. Do you see now? You cannot leave. The house will not let you. Adia stumbled backward, her mind racing. She had no weapon, no way out. Then something inside her shifted. A desperate, reckless thought took hold. If I can't take it off, I'll break it. Summoning every ounce of strength, Adia raised her arm and slammed the bracelet against the stone floor. A sharp crack rang through the hall. A sound like shattering glass. Baba Kofi's expression faltered. No. Adia struck again. This time, a deafening scream filled the air. Not hers. Not his. The house itself. The walls shuddered. The chandeliers above trembled. The air grew thick with whispers, no, not whispers anymore. Wails. Cries of the lost. The golden bracelet cracked further, glowing with an eerie blue light. Baba Kofi staggered, his youthful face contorting in agony. His skin, once smooth and perfect, began to wrinkle, dark veins spreading like cracks through porcelain. His hands, once strong, shriveled into brittle bones. No, he roared, reaching for her. Adia lifted the bracelet one last time and smashed it against the floor. The final crack split the air like thunder. The golden band shattered into dust. And then, they rose. The frozen brides. One by one, they stepped from the shadows, their faces no longer still and lifeless. Their eyes burned with something ancient, something righteous. Their voices rose in an unearthly chorus, a sound of grief, of rage, of vengeance long denied. Baba Kofi screamed. His body withered before Adia's eyes, the stolen years bleeding out of him like sand slipping through fingers. His once dark eyes turned hollow, his skin collapsed over brittle bones, until he was nothing but a husk, trembling before the women he had stolen from. The brides reached for him, their spectral hands pressing against his shriveled frame. Their whispers turned to wails. And then, darkness swallowed him whole. Adia fell to her knees, gasping, the broken dust of the bracelet still clutched in her fingers. The mansion shuddered once more, then fell silent. And for the first time since she had arrived, the air smelled of something new. Freedom. The first light of dawn broke over the horizon, bathing the land in hues of gold and crimson. Adia stumbled forward, her bare feet scraping against the rough earth, her breath ragged. Behind her, the cursed mansion groaned, its very foundation trembling as if the spirits within had finally exhaled their last breath. Then, with a final, shuddering sigh, the house collapsed into itself. A gust of wind carried its remains into the air, dust, ash, and the echoes of lost voices, until nothing was left but silence. Adia did not look back. Her limbs felt heavy, each step toward the village harder than the last, but she pressed on. The golden bracelet, once a shackle, lay in her trembling palm, its pieces crumbling like dry leaves. The village had just begun to stir. Women emerged from their huts, carrying empty pots for the morning's water. Children rubbed the sleep from their eyes. The men, preparing for the day's work, froze mid-motion at the sight of her. A hush fell over them. Adia, wrapped in torn wedding cloth, her face streaked with dirt and sweat, was supposed to be gone. Instead, she stood before them, alone. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Husbands exchanged uneasy glances. Mothers clutched their daughters. Elders whispered amongst themselves. And then, from the shadows of the gathering, the old woman stepped forward. Her eyes, sharp as ever, scanned Adia from head to toe. She did not ask what had happened. She did not need to. Instead, her gaze dropped to the broken bracelet in Adia's hands. She nodded once, as if she had always known this moment would come. The curse has ended. The villagers gasped. A man, one of the elders, stepped forward, his voice unsteady. What of Baba Kofi? Adia's grip tightened around the ash in her palm. The wind took the last of it, scattering it over the village like forgotten whispers. He is no more, she said. Silence. Then, one by one, the villagers dropped to their knees, heads bowed, not in mourning, but in understanding. The old woman turned to the men who had once gathered to discuss the fates of their daughters. Never again, she said, her voice firm as stone. No girl shall be given away to an elder. No daughter shall be sold for survival. We break this chain today. The men did not argue. They had seen the mansion fall. They had seen the girl return. And they had felt the air shift, the weight of something dark lifting from their village, never to return. Adia did not stay to listen. She turned her gaze to the horizon, where the sun stretched its golden fingers over the land. The dawn was warm against her skin, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly free. No shackles. No silent wedding halls. Only the open road ahead.